EBC, Eagle Broadcasting Corporation. Ito ang Radyo Agila. DCEC 1062 sa Mega Manila, DWIM 1080 sa Northern Luzon, DZEL 1260 sa Southern Taga, UYFX 1305 sa Visayas, at DXED 1224 sa Southern Mindanao. Ito ang Radyo Agila. Mabilis, malakas, pumapagaspas.
Magandang hapon mga kabarangay futurist at welcome na naman po sa Lakbay
Sarap talagang
Kinabukasan.
mag-relax kapag weekend. Pahigop-higop ng mainit na kape, tsaa o tsokolate. Nagbabasa ng dyaryo habang nakikinig sa radyo. Masarap kasama tuwing linggo ng umaga. Breakfast on board, linggo, 6 in the morning. Dito sa Radyo Agila.
Mga bagong kaalaman sa siyensiya at teknolohiya. Alamin sa programang Pinoy Scientist. Tuwing Linggo, alas 5 ng hapon hanggang alas 6 ng gabi. Pinoy Scientist. KBP Best Science and Technology Radio Program. Pinoy Scientist. Dito sa Radyo Agila.
Ayan, I had an early entrance. So, magandang hapon mga kabarangay futurist at welcome sa Lakbay Kinabukasan. Ito po ang kauna-unahang radio program sa Pilipinas dedicated to futures thinking at ako po ang inyong host, Dr. Custer, kasama siyempre ang ating kabalikat sa paglalakbay, Professor Sherman Ortega, UNESCO Chair on Anticipatory Governance and Regenerative Cities. Hello, Sherman. How are you?
Hello, Castor. Good to see you again. Maraming salamat for joining us in today's session.
Yes, we have a very interesting guest. Actually, we've been contemplating on interviewing our guest kasi it's so transdisciplinary, right? It's a biological, microbiology, and governance, and we are blending it with futures thinking. And Prof. Sherman, perhaps you may want to introduce Dr. Stephanie Fischel, and I see her on the screen. Hello, Dr. Fischel.
Hello.
Okay, Prof. Sherman, can you make the introduction?
Oh, yes. Yeah, Dr. Stephanie Fischel is actually, one of my advisors for my PhD dissertation. Just to be transparent to everyone at the University of the Sunshine Coast. And of course, she is an author of many books. And that one particular book that we will be discussing today, and I would like to know more about, is the microbial state. And she's currently a senior lecturer on international relations as well at the UNSC. Good evening to you, Stephanie. And yeah, Custer, back to you.
Okay, but before we start our interview, magpapabati lang si Dr. JD. Pinapabati po ni Dr. JD si Miss Maribel Beth Yonela Mamuad. She just turned 60 yesterday, October 25, at kasabay niya ang mom ni Dr. JD na nasa heaven, and her mom should have been 91. Okay, so simulan na natin ang discussion tungkol dito sa microbial state. And Sherman, this is the first time I've seen this unusual idea. Okay, I mean, all ideas are unusual, but in this case, Dr. Fischel is challenging the body politic, and it's all about the microbiome. So here's my first question to Dr. Fischel. Let's dive into your book, Dr. Fischel. It moves us away from body politic, okay, and into what you call as the microbial state, whatever that is. It sounds very interesting. So, what inspired you with this metaphor, and how will it transform the way we imagine governance and belongingness?
I think one of the things that made me really think through my discipline, which is international relations, and the way we think about bodies tended to be on a really old model, right? Kind of into germ theory a little bit, but generally centered around the thinking of Thomas Hobbes and the Peace of Westphalia, so 1600s, late 17th century. And in many cases, we haven't really talked about the body politic in new ways and the way science is understanding our bodies, which gives us a lot more clarity, but at the same time is still not answering all the mysteries of the human body. So what I wanted to do was think about if we took newer ideas about the body, and at that point, when I started this research 20 years ago, we were just beginning to think about mapping the entire human genome and thinking about the way in which our microbiomes affected our health. There were lots of things at the time, like Carl Zimmer saying, there were like luxury liners for microbes. What is our agency? How do we think through these things that likely really change the way we understand the connection between our brain and body? So that gut-brain connection was new. And I started thinking, well, what if we start thinking politically in terms of these newer scientific ideas of the body and diving into biology in a way that breaks us from past ways of thinking about the body?
Yeah, and that is quite some sort of covers the evolution as well. Like, let's just say, since the idea of, sovereignty as a concept was introduced, and then I saw in your book about, an image of the Leviathan, right? Like, and where it says that the, human is nasty, brutish, right? Like, it's so dirty, right? That needs to be cleaned. From that view, does that question that view that,
Well, I think metaphors around cleanliness can be very dangerous because of the way we think about current and probably through the 20th century immigration politics. There's a tendency to begin to bring together these notions of not just people as pests, but people are pests. Or so the problem of those metaphors also being dangerous. So in the book, I think a lot about if we do need a certain kind of contamination. One of the pieces I talk about is a contaminated state rather than an aseptic one. The way in which we look at the world not as a sterile laboratory setting, but rather as one that needs flow and needs movement through it to stay healthy, and that diversity is our strength rather than a weakness. I think that really spins a lot of our ideas about how borders work, because we know the immune system actually brings a lot more in than it keeps out. And much of the research during that time as well, I think because of AIDS, HIV, and now even more so with more of the species jumping viruses like SARS-CoV-2, we really have a notion of how we are kind of constantly embedded in our world and our bodies speaking with it. And what could that mean for thinking through different kinds of politics? So I try to do that with these different metaphors, maybe not better metaphors, but metaphors that more closely align to what our bodies are doing and what we could learn from that.
I'll be riding on your metaphor. So two things.
Okay.
First, the gut microbiome is known to affect the brain. Thus, the brain, in effect, we're looking at the gut microbiome somehow manipulating the brain processes and the way we decide. That's one. How will that influence governance? Second, we have two types of bacteria in our gut microbiome, which is the beneficial and the pathogenic, the probiotics and the pathogens. So, if we are to democratic, how do you see the interaction of those two types of bacteria and how will it affect governance?
Oh, that's a great question. So many ways I could go with this. I think one of the really important ways is it changes our ethics and the way we think about the world, because the things that we do in the world can affect communities. We have trouble thinking ethically about our human communities. And when we have to add the way in which, and I suppose some people might contest the fact that you would think about microbial communities ethically, but at the same time, we know our actions really affect them, right? Using antibacterial hand soap when it isn't needed, this hospital grade disinfecting at in our homes, especially, so it changes our cleanliness, the way in which we um, think about that, and that spectrum between the pathogenic and the non-pathogenic, I think is a really good one, because we know a piece of it. If we look at bacteria and quorum sensing, we can think about, well, how do they live within a body and then shift and control their populations to not become pathogenic, right? That there's speaking between, if we want to use that. I know that sometimes it's a little hard. We wouldn't want to give a kind of agency that we might give to other humans or sentient beings, but that they do have a way of understanding when they become unhealthy in a body. And oftentimes, another interesting way, I guess, to think about the metaphor is oftentimes we get sick from things that are not in their place, right? Everyone has E. coli in their guts, but you get sick when you have E. coli in a salad because you've got contaminated tomatoes. So we can often then, I guess that translates really nicely to rethinking public health. I know at the time I was at Johns Hopkins, one of the things that they discovered through I think the H1N1 was we don't need to wash our hands as much as we think, right? We can just like basically mechanically, unless you're doing surgery, of course. Again, another notion of how we understand our cleanliness within our spaces. So those are really big ways to think about it. Recently, I've been diving more into less around global governance and more about thinking about the way we can see this relationally. I've been doing work with a Finnish group on preschools and how our homes have become much more aseptic than they should be. And we're damaging our health to many. By killing all the bacteria, it leaves the good ones that help us in that balance between that, or that spectrum between good and bad, pathogenic and non-pathogenic, that keeping it on the symbiosis and commensal side rather than on the side in which we let other things. And I can talk, if you want, in a moment about some of the newer research thinking about microbes broader in our ecology, but I'll put that to the side for now. We can talk more about the metaphor if you like.
Yeah, a really interesting topic, right? Like, because when I was listening to Stephanie about her explanation, particularly the question that you just asked, Castor, is that it is the power to actually like spark a new type of public conversation, right? It inspires people to imagine, new types of public good. It in fact actually not just question our idea of what sovereignty is. If sovereignty is some sort of an agency that each and every individual has when it comes to participating in politics, it really gives you some sort of a feeling that you should in fact question the assumptions that we have now when it comes to the way we understand what sovereignty is and the way our structures of governance have been shaped, curated over the years, including the public policies that we do. In a conversation that we had with the National Academy for Science and Technology, the science always comes up, when it comes to public policy. But then, what are the ways by which we can make this public policy, scientifically conversational? And I believe, this book and the assertions that Stephanie has, can provide us, expand that idea that we can, in fact, discuss politics in the context of biomes or microbiomes.
Yeah.
Now, my question, Stephanie, is, assuming that that becomes some sort of, let's just say, public consciousness, we gain some sort of a tipping point wherein the kind of conversation that we have now is that, what would sovereignty mean then? And that's the first one. And second, about the idea of nationalism.
Sovereignty and nationalism, two of my favorite topics, certainly. I think one, thinking about the way in which bodies have changed, of course, reflects on your sovereignty, right? And the kind of words we have to talk about, in Western culture around how we are connected and related to other people have tend to fallen more to the atomistic and individualistic. And we can see that really being increased through, capitalistic neoliberal systems. And the thing about relationality is it tells you something about the world, but doesn't necessarily tell you what to do, right? Like, yes, we're all together, what does that mean? Like, how do we move forward? It's an ethical stance, but how do we enact that? So I think one of the most powerful things we can do is think about indigenous sovereignty, think about the way sovereignty is located very differently in many cultures, because I would say that a Westphalian sovereignty would be very different than, say, the cubby cubby notion, the traditional custodians of the land here in Sunshine Coast would think of it. So what we have to be prepared to do is fight to bring in these new notions, this new kind of language, these new metaphors, to be able to kind of widen our idea of the relationality, right? It's turtles all the way down means something quite a bit different if you're really connecting that to land and place. And the way we've done that, right, in Western tradition is nationalism, right? And in fact, if you're a Benedict Anderson follower, which one of my favorite ways of understanding nationalism, right, it started in the discovered worlds of the Europeans, and then was moved back into Europe as a way for the elites to say, well, look at all these people in these other countries we've encountered who have their attachment quite differently to the way they think about themselves and their cultures. How can we bring that back to Europe and infuse that? So the circular notions of nationalism based on elitist imaginings, I think, can very much be rethought to how we might understand ourselves across borders, as opposed to always having to define that in and out, which is where that metaphor then of microbiomes and the immune system comes in handy, because the immune system invites everything in, makes markers of non-self that says this part's dangerous, watch this part. It's a constant fluid evolution throughout our movement through our environment and how we understand it. But the trick is, again, I think it's always important to remember that we don't need any more bad metaphors, right? If we took some really bad metaphors from Darwinism, right? And I think Darwin was quite aware, from what I've read, of what the political ramifications could mean from survival of the fittest, which we can now see played out in so many places, right? It basically means, in Darwinist evolutionary terms, that you're the most fit in your place. Like, you are the one who can survive in that place, and that's what evolution does. It doesn't mean that it's the strong beating up the weak, right? So we can see then that nasty Brutishan short story getting injected into this other story, where it didn't. Certainly the way of thinking of that politically is important. And Lynn Margulis, who started really interesting ideas, a scientist around how we think about evolution through symbiogenesis, through how we evolve together. Her and her co-author and son Dorian Sagan say we can't afford any more bad metaphors. We really need to think them through. So one of the things I've tried to do in the last few years is think, okay, well, if we want to take metaphors from the natural world, how do we do it? Because take, for example, trees and forests, which I've written about in the last few years. We could say that trees tend to help their own species over another species. There's a few trees like birch that do feed other trees, but the things we know about forests now through the work of Susan Simard and other people in forestry, and looking at the way trees communicate, is that a forest very much protects the forest. It knows that the forest is what's keeping everyone safe. Again, if we anthropomorphize gently, which I think is often okay. I know I try to be careful because I know science is about precision. We don't like to, float too much into that world without acknowledging. But the fact that we could say, what might forests show us about living together that isn't just about feeding our own species, that we know if one becomes too many trees, too many small trees, too many bigger trees will affect the way the forest works, then we need to think about how that could work for human communities. How do we think about those things very relationally and carefully, and in emergence, rather than thinking about a static world that we could define in a slice and then say something about?
I'd like to extend the question about sovereignty.
Yeah.
Okay, so the microbial state suggests porosity, right? Openness, exchange, cohabitation. So how does that affect our idea of sovereignty when we deal with pandemics, climate change problem, when different nations would have to adapt and interact with one another diplomatically.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the pandemic has given us some interesting notions. If we think again about immunology, the work of Eula Biss, who wrote a really amazingly short and succinct, beautiful book, talks about how in the places we're at now, thinking about these viruses and the pandemics we're in, there's no frontier notion, right? We're only going to be as healthy as the sickest country. So one of the things it can tell us is governments, and I know, I mean, it's hard because I do understand the lack of trust in governments has also gone down, and we have,
Mm.
rising issues around fascism and white supremacy. So saying that we would trust governments, but I do think we need to. I think it was a missed moment to allow vaccine sovereignty to continue because of that very notion of we're only as well as the wellest person or sick as the sickest person, right? You can't close the gates on a virus. You can do your best, and I think our global lockdowns might have the horse might have already been out of the barn, but at the same time, locking things, slowing the flow of that virus. We do know that generally viruses adapt and become less virulent, but that's not always the case, right? And the way in which you can end a pandemic is to let it rip through a population and then create endemic issues. But we know with species jumping, they shift as fast as anything else. So we're in these new places, I think, with these viruses that are part of it's part of the destruction of our world. So we're interestingly, as humans love to do, the cause of our own problems. If we could think about the way in which we move into habitats, put species on top of each other, create, and in some cases, I've been researching this recently, the ocean, the changes in the ocean and the changes in the water temperatures are hot zones for our antimicrobial resistant bacteria and for viruses. So we're moving into a distinctly fearful future, I think, from that epidemiological point of view and a virological point of view, that we're just creating the conditions in which these things thrive. So maybe that's another way to answer your question, Dr. Fester, is that we need to think about the ways in which we make some things thrive and other things not, and that biodiversity, the metaphor of balance isn't always right, but thinking about the ways in which we live within this system. We're now through 7 of the 9 planetary boundaries, for instance. Nothing good can come from that. And one of the nothing goods will be from the fact that we're creating the conditions to thrive, which we can do with bread and beer and yogurt, probiotics, or we can create the conditions of other things to thrive, which we might not have as many enjoyable shared products from that. We will not be eating together in the same way in those commensal relationships.
Yeah, this is really interesting because now in hindsight, reflecting on how the Philippine government handled the pandemic, Dr. Castor, several years ago, and then talking about metaphors, and then Dr. Stephanie was saying about enough of the bad metaphors, but apparently like leveraging on that, I could see like several. I'm not sure if they were bad metaphors, but we can always see the outcome if they were good or bad. So, like for example. The pandemic, the virus was seen as an enemy, and therefore it was a national security issue primarily. And later on, they would realize that in fact it was a public health concern. And because that they were using this terminologies of war metaphors, like the virus as an enemy, the eventual implication of that is that you have this, governing entity that would place military generals, right, as the leaders of the pandemic council. And then of course, then the immediate policy and solution was lockdown and quarantine, right, and control, mobility, among other things. But then if you try to compare it with Singapore, the metaphor that they used was the circuit breaker. Right? It's not actually, it's definitely about the mobility of people, but the virus itself. Like trying to learn and how do you intervene to make sure that it doesn't spread out beyond control and just track those carriers, probably super carriers that would, ignite, a pandemic in a particular situation or area. So, here, really, like, when was the last time we've heard metaphors that relates to microbiology when it comes to conversation about public policy? Can you remember, Dr. Castor, that a situation wherein we've been using these types of metaphor in public policy, whatever that public issue may
This
be?
is unique. This is the first time I've ever heard of a governance and political thought that's related to microbiology. I don't know. I haven't heard of it.
Yeah, trying to remember.
Yeah, and
Okay.
cool
Yes,
thing
Dr.
about
Steph.
the cool thing about metaphor in science and is that we often always use metaphor to talk about science, especially with science communication, because it is often a very small realm. It's an invisible realm. It's a realm with a lot of very specialized language. As I was looking, I looked you up before this interview, Dr. Rezer, just to see like what you had published and things like that, so I'd have an idea of, you know, how we'd be talking about it and what your background was. And it makes me think like so much of that, even for someone like myself who's worked a lot in SciComm, I don't know. Like I don't know what's happening, right? And I noticed one of yours was called the Brotherhood of Mitochondria or something like that. So right, that notion that we take, that gives us an idea right away. We know, oh, brotherhood means something, right? And I can take that meaning from one place into another. And that, I think a lot of the work I use, the Lakoff and Johnson, who worked the metaphors we live by. And then there was an interesting Stanford study that was never replicated. So I had to kind of pull back on it a little in the book, because when I went back, I was like, okay, let's take a look. But Sherman, much of what you're saying, one of the things they played with is if you talk about a virus like a beast, or if you talk about a virus rampaging, that you get certain kinds of over militarized responses, right? And that's one of the important things I think is the way we talk about something will lead people in their policy thinking to respond a certain way, right? As opposed to trying to think about the virus as something we need to work with, and figure out the ways in which it doesn't thrive, right? We can't lock it up, right? It's going to move the way it moves, and in fact, viruses are interesting because they also test our knowledge of what life means. They're that strange little entity that really makes us think about how, as humans, we're defining the world in ways we understand it. And some viruses are alive, like some giant viruses, some viruses here. But I think it's also a very liminal zone, that kind of edge zone where we're talking about, well, why aren't they life? Do we change our definitions of life around the way viral actancy might work? Because they do have, I sometimes like to think like, does a species jumping virus want to jump? Right? Like these would be good questions just to ask yourself as a gentle question as a policymaker. Like maybe it doesn't want to. Maybe we're giving it the conditions in which it's forced to do something it doesn't want to do. Like viruses are relatively happy. They're not very many pathogentic. There are millions and billions and trillions of viruses. If you laid all the viruses on Earth, I'm not sure who did this modeling, but if you laid them all, they'd go all the way through the entire universe, right? There's so many. When we go swimming in the ocean, we have millions of them on us, right? That we live in a viral planet, and this viral and bacterial planet is being severely tested by humans. So I think the belief that we would return to the microbes at some point, we couldn't mess things up bad enough. It's not looking good at the bacterial level either. There are extinction crises in the ocean, in our bodies, in our homes. So our macro, I guess that's kind of the crux of it. See what you two think. Like the way we think between the big and the small, that's very important. And oftentimes the only way we do that are these kind of smooth spaces of business and economic metaphors, right? That businesses can scale up and scale down. And they can operate internationally and also nationally. Well, that's very different for us, right? And for our very small beings that are not as ubiquitous as we once thought. They don't travel as well as we once thought. There's longitudinal studies now showing us that there's a real problem in our microbial communities. And if humans continue to do this, a lot of the things we may be unknowingly, right, unknowingly supporting is also destroying the conditions of life. I've said in one of my articles that the condition for politics itself is a thriving planet. And how do we thrive? We thrive together, right, with biodiversity at the species, genetic, and systemic level. These are the things we support, and when we do that, we keep the conditions for all of us to live.
So that's I like the way you reframe leadership. Instead of control, it's about care and compassion, and that packs a lot of meaning into it. But sa pagbabalik po natin, tignan po natin kung paano maiangkop ang ideya na ito sa lipunan dito mismo sa Pilipinas. So marami tayong protesta, pandemya, korupsyon, sintomas po ito ng sakit ng katawang politikal na pwede natin tignan from the microbiome perspective. Stay with us, mga kabarangay futurists. Babalik kami sa Lakbay Kinabukasan after a short break. Babalik po, Pinoy Scientist.
EBC, Eagle Broadcasting Corporation. Ito ang Radyo Agila.
Ang tunog ng immunity na hirap lumaban sa sipon.
At tagal gumaling sa sipon symptoms. At tagal gumaling sa sipon symptoms.
Versus immunity na nag-Neozep Z Plus Forte, now with zinc.
Pinalakas laban sa sipon virus. Pinalakas laban sa sipon virus. Pinalakas laban sa sipon virus. Pinalakas!
Sa Neozep Z Plus Forte with zinc, pinalakas ang immunity versus previous formulation para bilis galing sa sipon symptoms by 2 to 3 days with proper diet and exercise. Kaya balik saya sa mga gusto mong gawin.
Alagang Unilab yan.
Phenylephrine HCl plus chlorpheniramine maleate plus paracetamol plus zinc is the generic name of Neozep Z Plus Forte. If symptoms persist, consult your doctor.
Neozep Z Plus Forte with zinc. Pinalakas ang immunity para bilis galing sa sipon symptoms. For Metro Manila and Bulacan area only. This is it, mga ka-Pure Gold. Sali na sa nasa resibo ang panalo. Pure Gold's 27th anniversary promo. Simula September 29 hanggang November 23, 2025. Pumili ng 2,000 pesos grocery with at least 300 pesos worth of participating products in one receipt. Iscan ang QR code at i-register ang inyong resibo. May chance kang manalo ng naglalakihang prizes linggo-linggo. Brand new gadgets, brand new motorbikes, Hakot shopping spree, tindahan showcase, P-wallet credits, brand new car, 1 million pesos cash, at marami pang iba. Kaya mamili na araw-araw sa Pure Gold. Presyo, produkto at papremyo, always panalo. Per DTI Fair Trade Permit Number FTEB 235474, Series of 2025.
Ang tunog ng immunity na hirap lumaban sa sipon.
At tagal gumaling sa sipon symptoms. At tagal gumaling sa sipon symptoms.
Versus immunity na nag-Neozep Z Plus Forte, now with zinc.
Pinalakas laban sa sipon virus. Pinalakas laban sa sipon virus. Pinalakas laban sa sipon virus. Pinalakas!
Sa Neozep Z Plus Forte with zinc, pinalakas ang immunity versus previous formulation para bilis galing sa sipon symptoms by 2 to 3 days with proper diet and exercise. Kaya balik saya sa mga gusto mong gawin.
Alagang Unilab yan.
Phenylephrine HCl plus chlorpheniramine maleate plus paracetamol plus zinc is the generic name of Neozep Z Plus Forte. If symptoms persist, consult your doctor.
Neozep Z Plus Forte with zinc. Pinalakas ang immunity para bilis galing sa sipon symptoms.
Welcome back to Lakbay Kinabukasan, mga kabarangay, and we're talking with Dr. Stephanie Fischel about how microbes help us rethink governance, health, and even the nation state. And we also listen to the commercial. It's all about immunity. So that must be data analytics and working, right? So it's a well-framed commercial break. Okay, so Dr. Fischel, we've seen before I left, before the transition, before we had the break, I talked about scandals, corruption, civil unrest, and we've been talking about that since last month with Professor Asanga. So, do you think these are signs of the body politic rejecting toxin? And do you think that's an immune response to bad governance?
It's definitely the way we've seen it philosophically, right? If you read Derrida, Esposito, even Agamben took his shot during, like Giorgio Agamben during that COVID. Yeah, you can really, you can understand, I think, the way in which our body processes could help us. But at the same time, I do always like to, I've always been troubled by this because again, that it can lead to some very like harmful thinking about other people. Like what happens if someone becomes the toxin, right? We do know that there is that Popper's paradox of intolerance has always been it's exactly what it is, right? A paradox. To be tolerant, you have to be intolerant of intolerance. So how are we like those are the kind of problems I think that we end up politically having to address. And and I think maybe the most important thing to take away from my thinking over the last 20 years is that we don't want science to become a technocratic response to a problem in which we think that, right, someone with it who is an expert can fix it. We actually need to have dialogue. We need to have lots of back and forth. We need to remember democracy, right? That a little bit of fascism never works for anybody, right? Like, this is very dangerous thinking. I think that definitely comes to play often. And while it's tempting to think that when the people you don't agree with are in power, um, you have to think about the ways in which when you take power, this is very typical in America, right? That Barack Obama came in, locked Congress and Senate, couldn't do anything, did a bunch of executive orders. Well, if you agreed with his executive orders and didn't you didn't want to stop, you wanted to stop drilling or do these environmental protections, then you create a framework for the next president who may take those executive orders in a different direction, which we've certainly seen now with the second Trump administration, that those same processes are being used by either side. And I think we're really in danger of what's called competitive authoritarianism, right? That once one party takes power, they take enough to keep the other party from coming back. And that's the sort of thing that isn't going to be fixed by a scientist, right? Giving us opinion. It's actually about more accountability, more transparency, more democracy. We can't go the other way. We know we're facing what I would say is probably a new threat, and that's our broligarchy, as the press calls it, right? That we have Musk, Thiel, kind of dangerous, very wealthy people who are now controlling and part of politics in such a way. We know that that tendency, regardless of personalities or particular maybe entrepreneurship or philanthropy, we need to think about the way in which we inject more support, capital, everything back into our bigger systems rather than relying on the goodwill of the people who hold most of the resources, right? We need to think about ways to do that differently. And that combination, I think, of science, of theory, always having a historian and and of course, science is, I think we often tend to call science something homogenous, like, oh, scientists. And you're like, no, it's not the case at all, right? There's a climate scientist and a microbiologist. What are they going to have in common? How do they talk? What kind of problem set will they and solution sets will they come up with? It's going to be quite different if you were then to ask a veterinarian and a neurosurgeon, right? So I think we really have to think about, and as much as we don't want to, as much as we want lists of things, easy ways in which we can intervene, we know that that's not going to help us, right? We need to understand complexity and different forms of knowledge. I think a lot of what happened in the pandemic in Australia, we might have had a pretty decent response, I think. And the mateship thing helped in Australia, right? We're all mates together. I think there was a coming together. But a lot of people just don't understand particular ways of thinking scientifically, right? When they would say it's a risk, I would watch the news and go, no one understands what risk you're talking about here. Like the risk of using AstraZeneca, which they didn't, that was what was bought for Australia. And then they found out there were certain heart problems with it. And they said, well, if you're older, there's less risk. No, that's not the risk we're mitigating. Like you're not explaining well and saying that actually when you're older, getting COVID, the disease might affect you in such a way that the risk of taking a vaccine makes sense. When you're younger, maybe COVID won't affect you that way. So that risk has to be balanced. So I kept thinking like, they're not explaining risk. People were like, oh, if you're old, it won't hurt you. No, it's still the same probability, right? It's still 1 in a million. But if you think about this is the other problem of thinking at populations, I think, which is very hard for people to accept. Like, yes, there's a risk of these things hurting an individual person, but the 40 million people who died could have been a lot more, right? So this is the other piece of that metaphor that becomes very real. You're actually absorbing the risk for everyone. Your personal risk is actually making someone else healthier, someone who's immunocompromised. So these ways of understanding how vaccines work and what they mean to build community. Jean-Luc Nancy wrote a beautiful little book, which he used the idea of the communovirus. He said, listen, the thing was, we talked about it like it was a communist virus, like it came from China, all of the things around that. He's like, but what we need to learn from that is we need to think about community. Like if this virus, if we don't have a vaccine for it, means you can never have a hug again, right? Like these are the kind of important things that you can be able to communicate to people. And the distrust of government, I think, should always be, and distrust of health systems. There are many populations who have been very abused by medical systems, especially in the United States, right? Indigenous people, Black folks, people of color. It's not an easy way of building trust through that because of the horrible things that have happened in the past. And those things have to be talked about, right? To have justice, you have to talk about what went bad. You can't just say, oh, sweep it under the rug, we'll move forward. Even our most liberal Western justice theorists like Rawls would say, you can't do that. To have justice, you have to discuss what happened in the past and move forward together.
Yeah. So my thinking is that when the immune system is contaminated by, let's just say, Dr. Kasser, as you mentioned, dirty politics, right? And you get the experts to do the intervention, like, for example, using medical metaphors like surgery, among other things, right? Like in the medicine, it creates some sort of a relationship of control because, the patient becomes powerless and suddenly, you have these doctors and surgeons like dictating, the kind of remedy or intervention they would make. And then eventually, the human body weakens in the process, and then it dies because, they've experimented on it, because the expert knows, right? And you know nothing about, strengthening your immune system. But then, of course, also learning personally, like, for example, when you're sick, right? Or if you have a cough or you have catched cold, right? And to amplify the ability of the body to actually heal and recover faster is you need care, right, from your community, like your mother and your father, your sister or your brother, right? So it's not just about the intervention or the diagnosis of the doctor that helps a patient recover faster, but then, care really is we've seen this personally. Now, in the context of the larger body politic, like instead of control, where the scientists and the experts dictates what the narrative is, in your book, Dr. Stephanie, I would like to hear more about the concept of care applied from the perspective of at least now your proposition about changing the way we perceive about body politics.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what I remember having some early discussions with my supervisor and her saying, you should really be talking about love. but that's not a topic in your field, right? Like it's not, international relations doesn't talk about love. Like it's a discipline about war and sovereignty and humanity and things like that. So having those words and the ability to talk about care is important. I think the other thing interesting at Sherman, as you were talking, one, if we think about it through the microbiome research and through the antimicrobial research, it's actually the wrong responses can be very hurtful. Like this is partly what happens anytime you get sick, antibiotics. Well, no, half the time, much of the time it's a virus, so that's an inappropriate response. So if we think about that in terms of politics, what are the sicknesses we're looking at in our body politic politically, and then saying, here, just take an antibiotic. Well, that's not it's not going to make you feel better. And that in fact, our immune system, right, we're in that funny relationship where it's our body that has all the symptoms, right? It's our body that's making us sick. It's not actually the virus, right? It's our immune system responding to that virus. So I think people get an odd idea of sickness because they're not thinking about how all the snot is to wash out the invaders, etc. So if we think about that, one of the great quotes from the kind of early studies around overusing antibiotics is, if we keep doing it, the microbes will win, right? And now we really are facing a future which we're seeing, staph and syphilis and lots of very serious. I have a friend who does this full time. She has a center on AMR, and she says we'll die from a paper cut most likely in the future. So things that aren't serious, haven't been serious, are now going to become that way again. So our responses need to make sense of the world in which you're responding. And I think that's part of why I ended up talking about sovereignty and our political systems, because I think the state as a political form loves to take credit for everything. Right, and politicians are good at this too. Like, oh, of course, everyone's healthy, we're all feeling good. Well, it's not because of you. It's like because of the immigrants who come in and work in the work to pick the crops and keep things running, and this flow in and out of our borders. It's because of tourism. It's because of clean waters and rivers, and I've had students working on water security, and the Tibetan Plateau and the rivers that come from that are incredibly vital. And just imagine what happens if those rivers dry up. Like, best case scenario isn't good. Worst case is nuclear war between the major powers that have the capacity. So we know that the flows in and out our borders, often the state as we see it now is like, I did that. And you're like, well, actually you didn't. You just took advantage of these processes that were more natural. And one of the interesting, in this latest paper I've been writing, I found some very interesting calls since 2021 from different groups of scientists, multidisciplinary, saying, what we need to do is not go into communities as scientists, as experts, and try to teach people things because they don't know. That we actually know that people have experiences of their place, and they know. It's like knowing your body. I think if you're a body aware person and you go to a doctor and they tell you things, you're like, no, like actually I'm aware of my body, and what you're telling me doesn't make sense. And that having that sort of experience with a scientist or a doctor is often what turns people to misinformation, disinformation, and kind of wonky health responses. Because, okay, well, maybe apple cider vinegar won't cure your cancer, but someone's listening to you, right? They're listening to you, what you know and what you want. They're not just telling you you're stupid and don't understand properly. So there's quite a few. I think there's a lot of scientists thinking about the way in which we do our interventions now, again, have to be thought at a community level and have to be thought of the experience of the people there as being just as valuable as that scientific or medical information coming into it. And that would really, I think, change the way we make policy, right? Policy is a really important outgrowth of politics. And if you need to have that kind of circular, especially when policy goes wrong, right? So I guess if we could take a metaphor of if we're not being taken seriously, if we're being told we don't know, if there's a paternalistic way of talking to other humans, then they're going to go to fascism, right? They're going to maybe go to supremacy or other things that make them feel like they're being respected and heard. And that's another important lesson, I think, is if we don't need to give people antibiotics, we shouldn't give it to them because that's going to give us more problems. And we should have the kind of politics that allows us to listen to people and to not. And I know I'm an academic, right? And that there's not a great, we used to call in the States the town and gown relationship, right? That there's often a lot between universities and experts. And I think part of it can be ameliorated by that notion of we all are experts in our own bodies, in our spaces. How do we have that be something we can use as a way to make policy? It's tough.
Dr. Fischel, so it sounds utopic. Have trying to get to that microbial world where everything connects. Leadership is about care, not control. Okay, so how do we move towards a post-nation era?
Yeah. Interestingly, I've done a futures, like a very simple futures, based in thinking about reverse engineering. Like if we have a person who has who embodies all these qualities we'd like to see, right? Has particular kinds of virtues that we think are important moving into the kind of complex future we have with climate breakdown and crisis, with species jumping viruses and AMR. What is that person we see in the future, and how do we roll that back?
Yes.
Right. So we've done some just interesting with the Finnish group I was part of, thinking about, what kind of schooling would that person have to have, right? How would they, what kind of travel would they have had to have? How do they relate to their community? Where would they have grown up? I think that's an important thing because sometimes starting from here is very difficult, right? We feel pretty frozen. And in my book, I use Paul Feyerabend, who was a kind of a philosophy of science in the 20th century, and he says, like paradigm shifts in that real sense of that, sociological notion, scientific notion of paradigm shifts. How do we get there, right? Like it's hard. Feyerabend says we can't dream something new within what we're in, right? We have to be able to dream and imagine something else. So I think that our politics and our policies will probably be changed not by politicians, but by activists and creatives. And we can see that the attack often on the humanities in our universities and on and art isn't just because we think it's useless. People actually know it's quite powerful. So it's that power of creative thinking and thinking differently, getting out of those institutional ruts. That's the difficult piece, and I think it's probably going to come from a place we don't expect. We got one, right? Greta Thunberg is a big example of that. Like, why would a young school child from, the Scandies be the one who starts the school strike for climate, and then move into the kind of activism she's been doing as a young woman? That's the kind of thing we should see more and more often, and we should try to. We can't. Like, we have to set the conditions for it. So what might we need to make that person in the future, and then we can come backwards from there.
Yeah. And really, I'm trying to imagine now, what kind of, societal relationship would you have if you, evolve your body politic or governance structure evolve by subscribing, for example, to these ideas, inspired and informed by, microbiology and microbes, right? And it tells you really about, it challenges our assumptions about power, really.
Yeah.
right? And it becomes disruptive for, many sectors of society, particularly, let's just say, the elite, when, the type of relationship that we have between, sovereign communities, if I may, questions our assumptions about power, right? Like, what would, political power or relationship look like if it is informed and driven by care instead of control, right? It just changes the dynamic. It flips everything, right?
It really
You
does.
know,
Yeah.
Sherman, I doubt if that will happen in Mars. because because it's because Elon Musk is the one heading Mars habitation. Okay, I mean, I
Yeah,
was hoping we can have a microbial world somewhere when we reboot humanity, but Mars, I doubt that that will happen.
yeah, but then again, as
And
you
Mars
mentioned,
is
I
without
think,
it. Yeah.
yeah, we've got a lot of dystopias now, right? And we're experiencing dystopias through and
Yeah,
through, in multiple dimensions, and many people are seeking for new type of utopias, and this is one particular alternative that we really need to like explore further, right? And use it as some sort of a narrative to rethink and reframe the kind of politics that we have.
Yeah, I think that gentle anthropomorphizing can be really helpful, right? Because that's a way you can, if empathy might be the highest form of intelligence we have, right? And our our systems now, think about our social media. This is all relatively new. I think in the 80s we were arguing whether this was a difference in degree and kind when we had the internet. Um, these things, they're they help us be atomized. They keep us from connection. They want you to stay home and binge Netflix rather than to go out and see friends at the riverside, right? They're made, you can think sometimes about a whole system is made to numb you, right? How do we feel again? And we could be, I think with AI, we can imagine the billions of dollars being put into this. What if, here's a thought experiment I saw the other day in an article. What if an indigenous woman created AI
Hmm.
and not all of these male oligarchs that we've got, all of these kind of entrepreneurs, and um, would we even have it, right? Or the fact that AI, we're already getting so much AI slop. Um, Within a year, especially if we lose human creativity, there'll be nothing left to feed it. Remember, it's just a predictive algorithm. And all of the things that we know make life matter and we care about, it's not digitized, right? It's not. It's the kind of wisdom we know exists, especially in our elders and in cultures that are verbal, that have such a long history, oldest, one of the oldest here in Australia. None of that's in AI, right? So we have this very thin, kind of sad and weak thing that we're thinking is the sum of all human knowledge, but it will be eating its own slop within a year because there'll be nothing left to feed it. Like, why would we write books now with AI? Right, to have our thoughts eaten and stolen by these predictive algorithms. I feel
it's
we're on the cusp.
killing creativity,
Yep.
killing empathy, and everything. But Dr. Fischel, I
I
think we
know,
have
right?
no more. I hope we can have a longer time discussing about your beautiful. I mean, I'm getting goosebumps thinking about the implications of a microbial future, and I hope leaders will learn a lot from reading your book. And I hope many people will be able to, or maybe a thinner version of your book, or a public friendly version of your book would be helpful because really, you're right. It's the change is gonna come from the ordinary people who understand and who wants to get empowered. So, thank you very much, Dr. Fischel, for a wonderful discussion. Sherman, what do you think about the what we've discussed the past hour?
Yeah, you know what? Like, it's pretty quite simple, but I think it's provocative as well. Like, for example, in our
Yes, it is.
constitution, right?
Yes.
Like, it says, "We, the sovereign Filipino people." Now, if you embed and integrate, reinform this by using this kind of idea, is that it will become "We, the living communities of this archipelago," right?
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah,
I love it.
it's a reconstitution of what it means to constitute sovereignty, right? Like the living communities of this archipelago, which mean goes beyond human,
And you have
right?
such a
Like, yeah.
beautiful, unique place there. Like, what a way to model. What a way to model. Right? Wonderful. That gives me
Like,
goosebumps.
yeah, yeah. And I think the future is gonna be about microbes. We are 1 is to 1.3 microbes to the human cell, and more than that, there are 10 times more viruses in our body compared to the microbes. Okay,
Yep.
so the world and the future is going to be microbial. It's going to be messy, alive, thriving, and interdependent. So with that, thank you very much at Dr. Fischel, Chairman, at sa lahat po ng nakikinig sa Lakbay Kinabukasan. Magkita-kita naman po tayo sa susunod na linggo dito lang po sa programa na kung saan ang siyensya ay buhay. Maraming salamat po. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you.
Thank you so much. I really
Thank you, Dr.
appreciate
Stefan.
it. What a lovely conversation. Thank you.
Mga bagong kaalaman sa siyensya at teknolohiya. Alamin sa programang Pinoy Scientist. Tuwing Linggo, alas 5 ng hapon hanggang alas 6 ng gabi. Pinoy Scientist. KBP Best Science and Technology Radio Program. Pinoy Scientist. Dito sa Radyo Agila.
Five decades of excellence in broadcast communication. EBC, Eagle Broadcasting Corporation. Ito ang Radyo Agila. DCEC 1062 sa Mega Manila, DWIM 1080 sa Northern Luzon, DZEL 1260 sa Southern Taga, DYFX 1305 sa Visayas, at DXED 1224 sa Southern Mindanao. Ito ang Radyo Agila. Mabilis, malakas, pumapagaspas.
Lazy days in mid-July.
Pure Country Sunday, 6 to 8 p.m. with Leander Denver Garcia.
Summer highways, sweet magnolia calls.
Remember when you fill up my senses,
Blinded by the light in his eyes.
Pure Country Sunday, Sunday 6 to 8 p.m. only here at Radyo Agila.
The one I love, she shines like silver. The one I love, she glows like moonlight. The one.
Pure Country Sunday.
two young people without a thing say some vows and spread their wings and settle down just what they need, living on love. She don't care about what's in style, she just likes the way he smiles. It takes more than marble and tile, living on love. Living on love, buying on time. Without somebody, nothing ain't worth a dime. Just like an old-fashioned storybook rhyme, living on love. It sounds simple, that's what you're thinking. But love can walk through fire without blinking. It doesn't take much when you get enough, living on love. old people without a thing. Children gone, but still they sing. Side by side in that front porch swing, living on love. He can't sue anymore. She can barely sweep the floor. Hand in hand they'll walk through that door, just living on love. Living on love, buying on time. Without somebody nothing ain't worth a dime. Just like an old-fashioned storybook rhyme, living on love. It sounds simple, that's what you're thinking, but love can walk through fire without blinking. And it doesn't take much when you get it done, living on love. You're living on love, buying on time. Without somebody nothing ain't worth a dime. Just like an old-fashioned storybook rhyme, living on love. It sounds simple, that's what you're thinking, but love can walk through fire without blinking. And it doesn't take much when you get enough, living on love. No, it doesn't take much when you get enough, living on love.
I had big plans for our future. Said I'd give you the whole world somehow. I tried making good on that promise. Thought I'd be so much further by now. Never could build you a castle, even though you're the queen of my heart. But I've had the best of intentions from the start. Now some people think I'm a loser, 'cause I seldom get things right. But you make me feel like a winner when you wrap me in your arms so tight. Please tell me you will remember, no matter how much I do wrong, that I had the best of intentions all along. I gave you a ring and I promised you things I always thought we'd do. But my best laid plan slipped right through my hands to show my love for you. And if you could read my heart, then you'd know without exception it was all with the best of intentions. You things I always thought we'd do. But my best laid plan slipped right through my hands to show my love for you. And if you could read my heart, then you know without exception it was all with the best of intentions. So here I am asking forgiveness and praying that you'll understand. Don't think I take you for granted, girl, I know just how lucky I am. Though you deserve so much better, you won't find devotion more true. 'Cause I've had the best of intentions, girl, I've had the best of intentions. Yes, I've had the best of intentions, loving you. Oh.
I don't know why I act the way I do, like I ain't got a single thing to lose. Sometimes I'm my own worst enemy. I guess that's just the cowboy in me.